welcome to this week's lecture. So we're going to cover two core topics today. Firstly, how we go about understanding language, so how we're capable of reading and perceiving other people's speech. And in the second part of the lecture, we're going to focus on some of the principles of communication and how we go about producing our own speech. If we, as our planet, was visited by another life form today that lands on Earth, then there aren't really many things that separate ourselves, us as humans, as being special from other life forms that are on the planet. Indeed, you might imagine that this alien life form comes down and it's looking around and it sees maybe like the bright features of wild birds such as parrots. You get the majestic form of a lion and its mane. You might have a peacock that displays its plumage. But you wouldn't really see any reason to single out us as bipedal animals, so us as humans, as really being anything different or anything special. However, the one thing that really sets us apart, that is our kind of unique characteristic, is our ability for language. Now, there are some animals that can acquire a form of language. So you have primates such as kanzi. You also have some birds such as parrots that can communicate, but this is generally qualitatively different to the way that humans can communicate, and also requires a great deal of training. So let's look into this special human ability of language. It's useful to begin by offering a definition for language, and one simple conceptualization is that language is a conventional system of communicative sounds and sometimes written symbols. So in other words, it's language that we communicate by speaking and also by writing down. Language also has a number of functions and properties attached to it. The most important function is it's communicative. So it allows us to communicate with others, to convey our internal thoughts, emotions, etc. Some of the properties of language is it's arbitrarily symbolic. So there's a arbitrary relationship between a symbol, so in other words, a particular word that we're using, and what that word represents. So if you think of the word rose, spelled R-O-S-E, this is representing the concept of a flower. But there's no kind of direct mapping between the particular letters and the word that's chosen to represent that concept of rose. It's generally kind of arbitrary. And this is in contrast to if you think, for example, of what might be considered a form of language. So the Egyptians used hieroglyphics, which represents particular objects with icons. So that's slightly different to a language. Whereas most of the time in our language, the symbols are arbitrary. It's also regularly structured, so there's a consistent patterned arrangement of symbols that are required to represent some sort of meaning. So these don't change over time. Certain patterns of sound make sense and are meaningful, whereas others don't. It's also structured at multiple levels. So at the very kind of lowest basic level, we have raw phonemes, such as kind of P and T sound. Then we have words such as pat, tap, pot. Then you have entire sentences. Then we would have much longer paragraphs, essays, etc. Language is also generative and productive. So although language must conform to general structure, we're free to combine words into an endless combination of novel sequences. So this is one of the features of language that I think is important, is that you can use it in new and novel ways to come up with sentences that firstly you've never heard before, and also potentially that other people have never expressed before. If it was the case that we could only repeat things that or sentences that we'd previously heard, it would be a very limited form of language. Language is finally also dynamic, so generally it's continually evolving. So if you think of new words that get added to the dictionary, there's a kind of flexibility of when new concepts or kind of new inventions come to life. There's new words that need to be required to describe these new objects or new concepts. It's also useful here to begin by thinking about the basic properties of language, and as is true of most things in cognition, language is hierarchical in nature. So at this very lowest level we have phonemes. These are the smallest level of speech sound that can be used to distinguish between one utterance in a given language. So for example, if you make two sounds or two grunts, the phoneme level is where you can distinguish these apart. In the example here, if you're wondering about the symbols, these are typically used as Greek letters to represent the sounds, such as theta is used for the th sound in the. At the next level, you have morphemes, and these are the smallest units of language that carry meaning. For example, the word recharge would be composed of two morphemes. We've got the r, which reflects meaning again or repeated, and charge, which possesses meaning of adding power. Similarly, in the sentences here, so we've got the sentence, the umpire talked to the players. Umpires consists of the meaning of umpire, which is basically a kind of referee of a cricket game, plus the fact it is pluralized, meaning more than one umpire. Then we have words, then we have phrases. When you put these together, normally in a particular order, which we'll see as kind of syntax, we then have sentences. Further, before we go on, I think it's important to be clear here that the focus is going to be on the English language. So for instance, in other languages such as Mandarin Chinese or Igbo, two words that consist of the same phoneme sequence can mean entirely different things depending on their tonal properties. So we have a hierarchical order of language components, but we can also consider the rules governing how words are put together to form grammatical sentences. And these grammatical rules are called syntax. And if English is your second language, you probably have decent explicit knowledge of many of the rules. Whereas I think if you're like me, if you've grown up with English as a first language, then much of your knowledge of syntax is generally relatively implicit. So I have quite a hard time articulating or explaining some of these rules of syntax in a way that I think other people who have learnt these rules explicitly would find them a bit easier. So indeed, despite being able to write with a pretty high level of grammar, it's remarkable how difficult I find it to explicitly state some of these rules. Generally, you can observe that almost all sentences contain both a noun and a verb phrase. A noun phrase is typically containing at least one noun, which is the subject of the sentence, along with a relevant descriptor of the noun. So in this example, it would be the fast horse. In contrast, a verb phrase contains at least one verb, and potentially whatever the verb acts on, which is known as the object. So in this case, jumped the fence. What about how humans are able to acquire language? Do you think this is something that is innate, that we're predisposed with, or is it something that we purely learn through exposure to the environment? Let's have a look. For one idea, we'll look to Noam Chomsky.
Language sets us apart. Other animals communicate, but they don't have anything approaching the sophisticated grammar of human languages. How is it that we learn to speak and think in language so easily? Young children become adept in a new language very quickly. Since the dawn of philosophy, thinkers have argued about whether or not we have innate ideas, Whether we are born knowing things, as Plato believed, or rather as John Locke and other empiricists argued, the mind is a blank slate on which experience writes. An American linguist, Noam Chomsky, gave a twist to this debate in the 1960s by demonstrating that children learning to speak just don't have enough information to form the complex grammatical maneuvers that allow them to generate unlimited new and original sentences. Yet they do so with ease. There's a poverty of stimulus. Something else must be going on. Chomsky's hypothesis was that there are inborn structures in our brain, what he called a language acquisition device, or LAD, which gives us a natural propensity to organize the spoken language that we hear in various grammatical ways. Without that, we couldn't get started as language learners. If he's right, language structure is hardwired as a kind of universal grammar. Our slates have been written on before we emerged from the womb.
Now, one question that has been the subject of considerable debate is whether language is innate. So in other words, whether we are genetically predisposed or hardwired to be able to use language. If you recognize the name Chomsky here, this is Noam Chomsky from the original lectures, or the early lectures in this course. The guy who was highly critical of the behaviorist approach. What he is perhaps most famous for, however, is his idea that because humans are able to acquire language rapidly, so generally most humans are able to master it by the age of 5, that they should possess some kind of innate knowledge of grammatical structure. Now, initially, he argued for the importance of a language acquisition device, or the LAD, and this concept is that we have this kind of instinctive mental capacity which enables an infant to acquire and produce knowledge. He later argued for the importance of universal grammar. And the theory of universal grammar proposes that if human beings are brought up under normal conditions, so in other words, not those of extreme sensory deprivation, then we will always develop language that has certain properties. So we would distinguish nouns from verbs, distinguish function words from lexical words. And this theory proposes that there is an innate, genetically determined language faculty that knows these rules. And this makes it easier and faster for children to learn to speak than it otherwise would be. This faculty, or this universal grammar, does not know the vocabulary of any particular language, so we have to learn the words and we have to learn the meanings. And there remain several parameters which can freely vary among languages. So, for example, whether the adjectives typically come before or after the nouns, and these things must be learned. So he found that there were some universals that were common to nearly every language. So for 35% of languages, we have a subject-verb-object order. For 42%, the subject-object-verb. But across these 98% of languages, the subject is coming before the object. So there seems to be some sort of consistency, at least in the way that some of the ordering and the configuration of language is represented. Despite being highly influential, Chomsky's views have been roundly criticised at a number of levels. Now, one of the main arguments that Chomsky made was this idea that children grow up with a poverty of stimulus. So in other words, they don't grow up with much kind of insight into the rules of language. And because they don't have much insight into it, they must have this innate knowledge of grammar. And if they didn't have this, they would be unable to learn a language as quickly as they do. However, more recent efforts have started to focus on the fact that children are actually exposed to a much richer level of linguistic input and knowledge than Chomsky originally claimed. So one of the ways that you can see this is the ways that parents communicate with their children involves child-directed speech, where we use short, simple sentences with a restricted vocabulary. it's also the case we would put extra stress on key words. So for example, if you're reading a story to a 2 to 3 year old, you might well emphasize certain words when you refer to the big scary dragon, however you want to tell that story. Similarly, Chomsky made a large case for there being these fundamental universal features of all languages. But it turns out that there are actually pretty large differences in languages and relatively few universals, suggesting it is perhaps unlikely that we possess an innate language ability, but we certainly do have a strong innate motivation to acquire language. And this innate motivation is relatively flexible, so depending on the language that we end up being exposed to, we can rapidly acquire and learn its properties. So some other examples of this, as you go around different countries and different languages, you find tribes that have absolutely no word order. There's Inuit language, which builds sentences out of prefixes and suffixes to essentially create these really long, gigantic words. There's also kind of native Canadian language, which doesn't have any nouns and verbs. So I think taken together, a lot of the evidence points towards the fact that we have this strong motivation to acquire language, but there's limited evidence for any sort of universal grammar or language acquisition device as being an innate thing that we grow up with.